The title of this slide is War. It should be War question mark, because I'm going to talk a little bit about how the divisions looked at the impending war, including foreign nations. So after Louis and his family had fled, and a period of time passed where they tried to cover it up, the news of his letters criticizing the government reaches the ears of the public. By July, after he was declared kidnapped, thousands of men and women are signing petitions denouncing these actions and calling for a new government. And the National Guard with Lafayette declares martial law in Paris. So there's this like foment in Paris that wants to get rid of Louis the 14th. I mean Louis the 16th. I'm sorry. This is when Louis signs the new constitution, which creates a single chamber legislature. If you remember, two chambers would be more power to the upper class, and a single chamber legislator would be more power to the voting public. Most people at the time, though, really did not believe in a republic. So at the same time, foreign nations look at this, and Austria and Prussia specifically issue this declaration. They're scared. They don't want us. They're seeing that a king could be deposed in another country by their people, and think that this could happen in their countries. And actually, in Sweden, there was a revolution that overthrew the king in Sweden. So this thing could ignite all throughout Europe. And they issued the Declaration of Pillnitz, all right, which basically it was a threat. They never actually thought that it would lead to war, but they're saying you better take care of Louis the 16th. If anything happens to him, we will declare war. So what does this do? It ends up really just inciting the mob of people in France. So eventually, the Legislative Assembly is forced to declare war. Now, what did people in France think of war? The Jacobins, which were the radical liberals, actually didn't want war because they thought that they needed to stop the counter-revolution within France. They needed to stop the nobility and the peasants who were revolting against these changes. The Girondins, who were the more conservative group of the liberals, they wanted war because they wanted to spread the revolution abroad, which is kind of contradictory. They wanted their own rights, but then they wanted to determine in other countries to spread this revolution. And this is why foreign countries are going to find this like really alarming. And there was the conservatives who wanted war because they actually thought that like Louis XVI wanted war because he thought that France would lose, and by losing the war, these foreign countries would come in and save him. So it's kind of crazy. So as this is happening, France is going to do very poorly early in the war. They're not ready. I mean, they have an army that's been dismantled by all the changes, and they are getting mass conscription and getting people ready. At this period of time, there's a riot that's in your notes right there in France. So like I said, everything's on edge, and they basically come into the Tuileries, Paris, and they massacre the royal guards, and Marie Antoinette and Louis and their children are imprisoned. And then now, all of a sudden, the troops are sent out because they are losing the war, and the Paris mob has gained control of France. Now, and this is kind of the period of time where the Jacobins now are going to align themselves with this Paris mob. So, Louis XVI declares war. You got to remember, even though he is under house arrest or whatever, he is still the king of France. And Prussia and Austria are at the borders of France. Now, at this period of time, all these rumors are circulating, and this concept of counter-revolution is beginning within France. People think that as foreign countries invade, it's going to give a chance for the nobility to take control again, and these voices are going to get stronger throughout France. At the same period of time, soldiers are being recruited for the war, and tons of people are showing up in Paris. So there's this crazy mixture of the people who had always lived in Paris, people from other countries who are coming in that are revolutionary people, and now you have all these people who are signing up and volunteering to go to war as they see that or they feel that foreign countries are going to come in and steal them of their rights. But it's also going to lead to really, really intensify some of the things that are happening, the divisions that are happening within the assembly. So these parish mobs, like I said in the last lecture, at some point break into the palace, and they demand that Louis XVI be arrested. And what ends up happening is the assembly now declares that France is in danger and sets aside the Constitution and declares emergency powers. And I would say this is like dangerous period where we give our government, or any government, a tremendous amount of power. As this is happening, like I said, Robespierre, he's going to be the famous revolutionary. He stands up in the assembly and calls for the removal of the king. The next day, and Robespierre kind of aligns himself with the sans culotte. He plays to the crowd, and I mean, he's not really considered the most dynamic of people, but somehow he ends up being the head of this movement. At midnight, they ring the bells of Paris. This reminds me of Game of Thrones for any Game of Thrones fans. And 2,500 men marched towards the palace. The National Guardsmen were just completely outnumbered, and the revolutionaries had taken the palace. So a new commune had created the republic, meaning that these people of Paris, right, had actually taken control of all of France because they wanted these egalitarian reforms. The king is sent to prison. All right, they hold new elections for a national convention, and they want universal manhood suffrage. And the people that emerge, like I said, is Robespierre, all right, who's going to be the head of the Jacobins. And then we have this man, Jean-Paul Marat, all right, and Georges Danton. Danton's a lawyer who threw himself into politics. And he is going to just incite this mob. He's the one who calls for 30,000 volunteers to defend Paris. In September, the new National Convention met for the first time, and this is in 1792. And in their first act, they ban the monarchy and they declare a republic. The day before this, and I'm going to talk about this more in the next slide, the new Patriot Army had routed the Prussians, and actually the war was turning in the side of France. So you could just imagine what it's like just sweeping through Paris in this period of time. So the king then is arrested. He is declared a criminal, and there's this fear of counter-revolution that is happening, as well as the fear of foreign countries coming in. So some people wanted to keep the king alive to buffer against like radicals, all right, so that they could temper this heat that's happening in Paris. So the debate happens, what are we going to do with the king? At this period of time, letters were found containing evidence of bribes to counter-revolutionaries. So it's actually found that Louis was trying to actually start this counter-revolution. So they accuse him as an ordinary citizen. They actually call him Louis Capet, which is the family name I've talked about a little bit in the past, against liberty of the people. So that is the crime. Remember, we talked about how in Great Britain that the king was charged with a crime against himself, but it was changed to a crime against the people. Louis denies everything, but it didn't matter. He was convicted with a vote of 387 in favor to 334, so it was close, in favor of execution. Marie Antoinette is going to face trial 9 months later on January 21st, 1793. So so much is happening in a short period of time. Louis professed his innocence in front of the crowd. The drum rolls, the blade of the guillotine falls, and a cry went up, "Long live the Republic! Long live liberty!" So this was a major event, and this is going to change not only politics in France, but it's also going to change how this is viewed throughout the world. Now, in countries like Great Britain, in the beginning of this revolution, they looked on and actually looked up to what was going on, thinking that they would form a government more like Great Britain. In America, they actually supported the revolution, but this act where they killed their king in public actually turned the tide, and countries like Great Britain and America now watched in horror. And it's going to start a debate throughout the world about power and the nature of power. Okay, now we're going to return to this war. Now, right as the new republic was forming, all right, the Prussians had crossed the eastern border and were 150 miles from Paris. So this led to like this wave of hysteria, and this is when Parisians are going to attack prisons, and there's going to be just violence as all these people are coming into Paris. Um, in September, the Prussians and former French nobility, they were called émigrés, the ones who left France, had taken Verdun, and they were like 150 miles from Paris. And there's this strange battle where a Prussian general failed to engage the French, and they don't really know why. That they kind of had the French on the run, and the French troops end up winning. This is the Battle of Verdun, and this is going to turn the tide of the war. So the French win this big battle, and some of this is said to, and this is something my dad always said, is never getting engaged in someone else's revolution. Because the French troops were fighting for something, like an idea, and the Prussian troops and the Austrian troops were not fighting for anything for themselves. But regardless of said, the Prussian army lost, and the French army fought with a purpose. And the Prussian army had the French on the run and could have won the war, but the French win. After this, there's a draft, and the French army goes to the by 1794 to from 650,000 men to more than 1,000,000. All right, and this is going to be the largest uh, army in Europe. After this, France is going to go on the offensive, and they're going to declare, this is right around the same time, right after they win this first battle of Verdun, they declare the Republic, they go on the offensive, and they try to spread the revolution throughout Europe. Right? They invade all these countries and try to free the people from oppression of monarchists and absolutist rule. And this is what's going to bring Great Britain into the war, which had kind of been sitting on the sidelines for all this time. And when they invade all these countries, they are going to declare that the people to be free, and they're going to it's basically going to make things worse, because all these other foreign countries are going to look and they're going to be scared, and what's going to happen is they're going to face a huge coalition of foreign countries, and it's going to lead to basically France versus the rest of the world. Now, the crazy part of this revolution is this fact that not only was France at war with basically the rest of the world, at the same time they're fighting this war with the rest of Europe, there's a civil war within France. So let's explain, and I've kind of talked about how these factions have developed, but in 1793, there's a counter-revolutionary uprising. Now, the biggest threat to revolution is always counter-revolution. All right, this is one of the things that later on Lenin, why he was so extreme, is he was always trying to root out counter-revolution, and that's what led him just like killing off half of Russia, or Soviet Union. But in 1793, it began in a western part of France called a region called the Vendée. This is where it's going to be the strongest form, and the counter-revolution came not necessarily even from the nobility or former nobility, but it came from the peasants. And you have to remember that the peasants are going to be more religious, so those religious reforms on them are going to be really resented. And within different parts of France, certain peasants were doing better than other peasants. So in northern France and in the Vendée, the peasants actually did better. This is historically owned more of their land, and as the reforms started going around, they tried to be more egalitarian. Their taxes actually went up under the revolution. And to make matters even worse, some of those former emigres or the nobles who had fled were trying to incite this, but this was grassroots. This was people not happy with how they were being governed in this new republic during the revolution. And it wasn't just the religious thing. The big thing that actually kind of incited it is the Jacobins started setting up the National Guard in these areas to try to recruit men for their new army that's growing and growing. And these peasants did not want to be part of the army. So they're paying more taxes. Their religious rights are really being like restricted or practically humiliated. And now they're being recruited to serve into a war. So as this infuriation starts to swell, there's one example where a recruitment officer was stabbed in the heart. And one of the constitutional clergy, remember, those are the ones who pledged allegiance to the state, not the ones who still pledged to God. Those were the non-jurors. And they tied them all together with a chain, the people who were recruiting them, shot them, dumped them into a moat, and this like just blew up the whole movement. So um, this was something that they really never could get under control, because this was kind of like a guerrilla warfare thing that started to happen. What we really need to know is that there's two different wars going on. There's wars within France, people who are resenting all this change, and then there is war with basically the rest of the world.